Australia, and doing a project which brings together Indigenous writers from Australia along with Dalit and tribal writers from India. And with me I have this very exciting group of writers from Australia, 3 Indigenous writers before you, Nicole Watson, Jared Thomas and Ellen Neerven, and today we'll be talking to them about their experiences of writing in Australia. So we'll get started off right away, Jared, with you. Could you grew up in Port Augusta and you started writing theatre at some point of time. So could you talk a little bit about your life growing up in Port Augusta and what brought you writing drama?
Okay, well, yeah, so I grew up in Port Augusta, which is a town of maybe 12,000 people. And both my grandfathers are Aboriginal men. So they're dark-skinned Aboriginal men. My grandmothers are both white, okay? So one is English, one is Scottish. But I grew up in Port Augusta, which is a small town with a lot of racism. The colonisation was very severe. Frontier violence, the protection era where people were placed in institutions, assimilation, and then post the civil rights movement, a move towards self-determination. I was interested in current affairs and I watched many programs about Nelson Mandela and apartheid in South Africa. And I felt that where I grew up, there was prejudice and discrimination at such a degree that it was like apartheid, an unofficial apartheid. And I could see those experiences. I went to watch theatre in 1992 when I was a student, and I was waiting at the front of the theatre. And 2 Aboriginal men went to gain entry into the theatre. Some security came up to the men and said, "What are you doing here? This is theatre." And they said, "We want to enter the show." And the security said, "No, you can't. Do you have a ticket?" And they produced their ticket, but they still weren't allowed to gain entry. Then they pointed out that they were dressed well. They were wearing nice shoes, nice slacks, shirt, jacket. Still, the security would not let them in. I was standing there with my Aboriginal peers, watching, feeling powerless, because I'd grown up in a situation where Aboriginal people didn't have a voice, couldn't speak against these injustices. So we eventually went into the theatre, and a few minutes into the first act, the Aboriginal men came out onto the stage. And they spoke to the audience, and they said, "You watched us out the front of the theatre not gain entry. Why didn't you speak for us? Why didn't you support us against this discrimination, this prejudice?" So I was in year 12 and then I started writing. I seen a real power through theatre, a way to tell the stories of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my father. They'd been institutionalised in a mission, not able to eat the food they wanted to eat, practice our religions. So then I started writing and I was fortunate. I told a story about my grandfather who gained permission to run in sprint races, and he put some money on himself and he won, and he returned to our town, his traditional country, and wanted to buy land, his traditional land, but wasn't able to because he was black. A Kenyan and a Ugandan theatre director, my play came to their attention. And then in year 1999, when I was 21, my first play was produced in Kenya and Uganda at the National Theatre. So that's how I came to writing theatre. That's how I come to find my voice and to speak with my family members about those injustices and find ways to communicate them and share those stories.
Thank you, Jared. Maybe we'll turn to Nicole now and ask Nicole why you came into writing.
Good morning, everyone. Like Jared, I also have Aboriginal and European heritage. I was born in Queensland, and if you're Aboriginal and you're born in Queensland, you're a Maori. And when I was born in the 1970s, Queensland was quite an impressive place. marginalisation of Aboriginal people on missions. But as Jared said, there was also a very strong civil rights movement in Australia. And I had relatives, particularly my father, who was very prominent in the civil rights movement. So I grew up very aware of injustices and aware that the law had been a powerful force in these injustices, because there was always legislation that authorised these acts of discrimination, and often the people who enforced those laws were police officers. So I began my career as a lawyer. I was also inspired to fight for our people, and what I found with the law was that it tended to perpetuate injustices. And I also found that Aboriginal voices were marginalised in the law. And when I was a young lawyer, I began to work in native title. In Australia in 1992, our High Court finally recognised Aboriginal rights to land. And there is now a process for Aboriginal people's title to land to be recognised. But I found that the process was quite colonial still. So I turned to writing because I found that writing offered me a vehicle to empower Indigenous voices and to bring Indigenous voices from the margins to the centre. So my experiences as a lawyer, I contextualised my writing. So my first crime novel, for example, was about a native title claim that is unsuccessful, and an assassin then comes to kill the lawyers involved in the claim. I also have ventured out into writing columns. I have written columns for Indigenous media, and I also work as an academic, published academic journal articles on how the law marginalises Indigenous people.
I'll turn to Ellen now. Ellen, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the implication of genre for Indigenous writing. How they operate with mainstream canons don't really apply in a similar way to Indigenous writing. So could you speak about that with reference to your own writing?
In the last 20 or 30 years, the writing that Indigenous writing, the genres that Indigenous writers have been working in are mainly life story and poetry. But in the last couple of years, this has been changing and expanding, and Indigenous writers are writing across a range of genres, including crime writing, including fantasy and romance. Because there's more of an audience for these stories, and more promotion that our stories are important, and we can write about it if we want to. The expectations have gotten wider. My book is it can be read as a collection of short stories, or it can be read as a novel, and it fits a little bit uncomfortably in both, which I don't mind. I think a lot of our writers write short stories, or we write novels that tell different stories in one book, and it's a little bit looser in that structure. That traditional European structure of a novel doesn't really fit quite neatly into our experiences, I've found. So books like Marie Moncara's Every Secret Thing and Tara Jean Rich's Quality Care, which are both recent books in the last 10 years.
Can I ask you to raise your voice a little bit?
There's a mic.
If you don't mind. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. Yeah, they are both novels, but they also can be read as collection of short stories. So my book is in 3 parts. The first part is a family story, which incorporates different voices of one family in different generations. I like to think of it as a family story that's told in these point of views feels a bit more real than just being told from one perspective, because we all have family stories, but when we tell them when we meet, we all have a different way of telling them, and what we leave out, what we choose to tell is different. So these younger characters and the older characters have a different way of looking at the world. And also this first section incorporates there's a family secret involved with the grandmother of our main character, and we are unaware of her identity as a mystery. We are unaware of her story, and that slowly becomes revealed through the course of these characters telling their story. And the second part is it is a futuristic dystopian novella about Australia in the near future, and a lot of things are changing quite rapidly. The environment is changing. The policy of the government has is going in a very fast direction, and is changing, is getting people very confused and very agitated. And it also involves these mysterious creatures that are coming out of the water. I think I'll probably talk a little bit later about these creatures. And the third section is a loose collection of short stories. So these are pieces that are not tied together, and they're about mostly young characters growing up where I live in Brisbane and Queensland, southeast Queensland, on the coast, and incorporating recent histories of floods in Brisbane, and the political climate at the moment, and also popular cultural references as well. It's very much, it's the most autobiographical section. So you can see that there's a vast variety of the stories that I'm choosing to tell in this book, and it doesn't fit in that traditional structure. And also, I find from talking to other writers, and also across the board, Aboriginal writers that work in theatre and work in film, and comedians, that sometimes we don't really, our stories to others, to the non-Aboriginal population, don't really fit. I recall a conversation that I had with a film writer who talked about that they kept wanting her to change the ending of her film because they didn't feel like it had come full circle, that it wasn't complete. But that's sometimes how we write. It doesn't reach that resolution that people expect, but it feels right to us.
Thank you, Ellen. Nicole, you you take up a kind of traditionally established genre of fan fiction, but you do something very different with it. So could you speak a little bit about that?
In Australia, there's really only two of us who are publishing Aboriginal crime fiction. There is a Kamilaroi writer, Philip McLaren, and myself. And I think that our experiences with crime fiction mirror the experiences of other people who have been othered when they turn to crime fiction. What we tend to do is we don't actually replace European detectives with Aboriginal detectives. What we do is we actually subvert the genre. And one of the ways that we do this is to make land the centrepiece of the story. Land in Aboriginal crime fiction is often a motive for murder, but it's also a character that has agency in the story. So, for example, in a lot of Aboriginal crime fiction, the plot will revolve around land theft, and the protagonist will not only be a detective, but the protagonist will also be involved in attempts to get the land back for his or her Aboriginal community. The land is also a character that has agency. So in some Aboriginal crime fiction, the land will actually exact justice. And I remember in one story that I was reading recently, the killer was a miner who wanted to steal land from an Aboriginal community. And the killer is apprehended and he's actually dealt justice. He actually dies. But it's not the detective that does that, it's the land. The killer is, he receives his revenge when there's an avalanche and he's killed in the avalanche. So I think that's one of the ways that Aboriginal writers subvert the genre, because land is always in the background and often at the forefront of the story.
Thanks, Nicole. Land is at the center of your writing as well, Jared. You are a young adult, new adult writer, and there is a centrality and importance of land in your young characters as well. Could you tell us a little bit of how you achieved that and why?
Okay, I think India knows poverty very well, and I don't think it's right to have some kind of competition about poverty. But within Australia, it's a first world nation, and Aboriginal people are living in third world conditions. Many of us, our old people, don't live to be very old. The life expectancy is 20 years younger than non-Indigenous people. In the last few years, the Australian government has started to again push into Aboriginal lands. So there were 76 communities that were taken into government administration, and in a 2-year period, a 300% rise in mining licenses. Okay, so with the land, it's very central, I think, to young people, because we're coming to grips with globalisation. So colonisation and globalisation, and we're always looking at different influences, whether it be popular culture, foods, etc. And there's massive increases of sugar, diabetes, heart disease, these types of problems in our community, shifting away from our traditional diet. So land is a source of strength, and the stories that we have for land, the connection that we attain from land, can provide a real sense of purpose. So there's so many distractions for young Aboriginal people in our country, and land and knowing of our stories. You may have heard of the term the dreaming, which is usually a term used to describe Aboriginal mythology. In Nukunawarala, my language, we say Yura Muda. So Yura is person, Muda is country. It's the reciprocation between land and person. You give to country, country gives back to you, it protects you. So with a lot of my writing, I'm fortunate to have those stories continue to be passed on by my elders, and I work within the arts for the South Australian government. So I'm always meeting with different dancers, choreographers, musicians, poets, etc. And at the centre of our work is the protection of country. It's essential, of course, for our existence.
Thank you, Jared. Ellen, you mentioned just a few minutes ago that a lot of contemporary Indigenous writing is about speculative fiction. It has a kind of a reimagining of land, space, character, the way that human beings can exist. Would you like to elaborate upon why you think this kind of predominance of certain kinds of things of speculative, reimaginative fiction is happening in Indigenous Australian writing?
I think one of the reasons is that we are, on the verge of some, environmental collapse. The climate change and the threat to the environment is very much real, and it's something that a lot of our writers are exploring in our fiction, like Ani Alexis Wright in her books, Chakraborty and the Swan Book. And I think that, it's, as Jared said, our connection to country is very real, and this environment threat is a threat on the way that we live. And since colonisation, 200 years, 150 species have gotten extinct in Australia. So that rise extinction is much higher than you know a gradual shifts before that change to the country. And so I think the difference between Indigenous writers writing speculative fiction, writing fantasy, writing dystopian narratives, is that we're not writing about the other. I think non-Indigenous writers look at whether they're writing about creatures or they're writing about a threat or they're writing about science. There's always a sort of othering of people of this threat, but we see it as very much all connected.
Thanks, Helen. These concerns that Indigenous writers have are personal and they belong to the larger political sphere. So how does your personal life and professional life inform your writing, Jared, in terms of your own process? And how does your book, Calypso Summer, how would that speak to an Indian audience? It was listed as one of the best books in iTunes soon after it was released. So I wonder if you could talk about both the personal and professional impact of your life and the way in which that can translate to audiences here in India.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I work for the South Australian Government in the arts, so I'm constantly in connection with communities. And then also I've been fortunate with our family that we possess 4,500 hectares of our traditional country, which we co-manage. So I'm currently the co-chairperson. So I'm always, I'm quite fortunate, I'm educated, I have good employment. It's not the case for many of my relatives, older family members, younger family members. So I'm looking at these particular issues and very closely engage in them in the life of people around me and talking about these things. There's incredible historical stories that I could write. There's many that are incredible stories of struggle and courage. But they're things that I'll write later. For the moment, I'm looking at what's happening to our younger people. And youth is a very, I think, very testing time where you can be having conflicts with your family, trying to establish your own identity, break free, new experiences like going to university, first love, maybe coming into contact with alcohol and different things like this. So there's a lot of really important decisions that are made during our youth. So with Calypso Summer being listed as best book in iTunes shortly after its release, I think it was more about its universal appeal. And these things not only just being issues that young Aboriginal people are facing. With Calypso Summer, how does it relate to an Indian audience? Well, the central character is very interested in one-day international cricket, in cricket. So I think there's certainly that link there. And commentary on the great Indian and West Indian cricketers in particular during the 1980s. And I happen to have cousins that are Indian, so that they have a Nukana mother, Nukana father, to brother and sister that both have married an Indian woman and Indian man. So within our family there's a scene, because this is fiction but based on my family, where instead we once used to put the kangaroo tail and the kangaroo into the coals. These days we have kangaroo curry and kangaroo crab in our family. So there is that kind of Indian influence within Aboriginal Australia. And yeah, I think this young man is disconnected. He's very disconnected, he's lost, and he's looking for some purpose in his life. And it's through observation of the traditions. Stephen Mukey, an Australian academic, says we are both ancient and modern. We are all ancient and modern. And I think for Calypso, it's learning to be discerning. Learning to find those things within our cultures, our pre-colonial knowledge, the strength in that, and looking at what can take us forward into the future. What do we need to be hesitant of? What do we need to abandon?
Thank Thanks, Janet. My next question, and this will be the last one to Nicole, and then followed by one for Ellen. You know, Australia is, the land in Australia is marked by Indigenous presence or everywhere. And place then acquires a very, very important role in your fiction. Place itself functions as a character. And this morning when we were speaking, you said place is a character and has agency and wears the wounds of Indigenous people. So could you talk about the importance of place in your crime fiction writing?
In my novel, The Boundary, as I said before, it was based on a failed native title claim of my former home of Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland. And I called it The Boundary because the name is taken from Boundary Road in West End. That's a very cosmopolitan suburb. And there are a number of boundary roads in Brisbane. And the reason why they're called Boundary Road is that they were the boundaries that Aboriginal people were not allowed to cross at night. In Brisbane, like many places in Australia, we had curfews, and these were enforced in the early part of the 20th century. But to most people who now live in Brisbane, they have no idea of that history. So one of the things that I try to do in my crime fiction is to fill in those Aboriginal histories of a place, which is something that I tried to do in The Boundary. But we do more than just fill in history. I think that because of our strong connections to the land often reflects the wounds of its people in crime fiction. And an example of where that happens is in a movie by the Aboriginal filmmaker Ivan Sen, and it's a crime film. And it's set in a country town, and a serial killer is, a suspected serial killer is murdering young Aboriginal women. And the movie begins with the sign Massacre Creek. And underneath this sign is the body of the first victim is found. And this place is drought-stricken, and there is a general malaise over the town. And one of the themes of this film is that this place is haunted by an earlier but unacknowledged crime, and it is the crime of the original massacre. And I think that very powerfully demonstrates the connections between Aboriginal crime writers and place, because they're so close that the land will often wear the wounds of its people.
Thanks, Nicole. You push the boundary in a different kind of way, Ellen. You have really amazing and strong characters who are taking identity, what it means to have an identity, to a completely different place, and very surprising place in your novel, Heat and Light, in this writing. So can you speak a little bit about identity and its malleability and the way in which you are reimagining identity for a different kind of future?
Sure. I always think that that as writers we should be writing extraordinary characters. You know, we write about ordinary people, but in some ways they all have extraordinary qualities. And you know, I think of Harry Potter. You know, he's a very ordinary looking boy, but he has a big lightning star on his forehead. And so I think that you know, we're always looking to create characters that have a point of difference from everyday people. But that also represents the extraordinary qualities that we all have, that may be hidden, that we may not have a big lightning star on our forehead, but we certainly have something inside of us that makes us different. And so my characters, I do have some interesting ones in Heat and Light. I mentioned before about these mysterious creatures that I wrote in my environmental dystopian novella. And these are creatures that are part plant and part people. And they're like a mangrove, so they have roots that sit in the water, but that they also can move as people move. They can also walk, and their existence is very interesting. It's can't reveal too much about how they've come to be, but that their presence and their ability to speak a language that feels like it comes from the country is a very important part of how the story develops and how the human characters interact. And I also write in a more realist sort of way. I write about a character that has been cursed. A woman called Pearl has been cursed to not bear children. That she passes on this curse to another woman and is able to bear a child. This child is not going to be the same because of this. And yeah, I write on extraordinary characters, and I also like to write unusual love stories as well.
Thanks, Ellen. That's really wonderful. All three writers have kept absolutely to time, so we have a nice chunk of about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. So if anybody has, yes?
In different ways, your books are written in terms of giving fiction to people who perhaps haven't had a voice before. So you're writing for Indigenous people, or perhaps are you writing to give that voice from within to others? So who do you see as your audience? Are you trying to educate people in terms of the experiences of Indigenous people, or are you creating fiction for those people themselves? Or maybe it's both.
I write in the first instance for my family. So I write for my daughters, I write for my cousins, I write for my uncles and aunties, extended family, to see ourselves, our stories reflected in literature. But then there's also writing for a broader audience. We need other Australians to know our plight, to support us. And there are many non-Indigenous Australians and new immigrants that are beginning to support our particular situation.
Would the other two want to respond?
I agree. I think that we write for both. I think I'm particularly motivated by the current situation in Australia, though, where there is not a plurality of Indigenous voices in the public sphere, and that's occurred for various reasons. But at the moment, we have maybe 2 or 3 very prominent people in the public sphere who have a particular position in relation to policies that affect our people, but it's very difficult for other voices to be heard. So that is getting I guess that's one of the driving forces behind my writing at the moment.
I write for both too. With my writing, I want to create change. I want to make people think about things that perhaps they hadn't thought about before. But I also write for my own people because I know that my experience growing up is that I didn't have access to work by Indigenous people. There wasn't Indigenous people on television and in movies and that sort of thing. And so I think it was easier for me once I found those stories to be able to think, I can write my own stories as well. So I think of the young people that weren't unlike me when I was younger, and I think if they find my story, that they might think that they can tell their stories as well.
Just a curious question. I would like to know, is there any positive feedbacks coming to you through your writings from the government of Australia? Because I want to know anything positive, any positive atmosphere that you can realize through your writings from the present government of Australia. Is there any?
No. The governments, various government departments will sponsor initiatives such as this, theatre companies and dance performances, etc. But there's so much white noise occurring that we're lost amongst it. So we're not really deemed a threat at the moment. So we need to gang up with others, I think. So I'm writing to kind of get people to join my game, I think. And that's what a lot of us are doing, trying to share our story. our government at the moment, as I said, we're still in a process of colonisation. Our people are continuing to be moved from lands. We have the highest incarceration rates of our people, very low literacy levels, third world diseases, otitis media, trachoma within our country at high levels. So no, the government isn't receptive. That there are individuals, there are good individuals that are receptive, but the government as a whole, no.
Any other questions?
There are so many uncomfortable resonances between what the three of you have said and what one experiences here. And it's really been revealing to see how there are grey areas even in the so-called first world. When you speak, therefore, of trying to make a change or trying to write for both sides, etc., and you just talked of, ganging up, do you have, for instance, any sort of interconnectedness with the other side? You did mention that there was support from non-Aborigines, but how much of a movement is too simplistic a term, but just in terms of the overall scenario.
I'll talk quickly and then hand on to the others, sorry. But with the reason I talked about the ganging up is because we're a minority in our own country. So we need to have develop alliances with other groups. So there's a big Indian population in Australia, there's a big Māori population. We have been colonised by the same people. We've had similar experiences, so we need to share those experiences and see how we can have more of a friendship, partnership, so that we can focus on the injustice to move forward. There was a situation in, I think it was 2007, where 1 million Australians walked across Sydney Harbour Bridge for reconciliation. So walked together as one voice to force an apology from the Australian government for the removal of 100,000 children that were taken from their parents, to be put into foster care and institutions and other things. So that's probably the best example of that within my lifetime.
Aboriginal political movements have always enjoyed alliances with other groups, and during the civil rights movement in the 1970s, we had support from the trade unions, the anti-apartheid movement, and also the movement against the Vietnam War. So we've always had those alliances, but whoever is in power has so much influence on the electorate. Our former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, once said that when you change the government, you change the country. And when he was kicked out of office in 1996, he was replaced by a government that was very hostile to Aboriginal rights, the Howard government. They slashed our budget within the first few months of claiming office and refused to apologise to the stolen generations. And they were in power for 10 years. So they had a significant impact on how the electorate feels towards Aboriginal people. And unfortunately, his protege, Tony Abbott, is our current Prime Minister. So we're holding out. And if there is something that Aboriginal people are very good at, it is waiting.
Yep.
Because we will outlive the Abbott government, and yes, we will endure beyond them.
Thank you for your question. The sort of friendships that Jared was talking about are the reason that part of the reason why we keep going. That shared understanding and that sympathy and is part of the reason why we continue to feel that there is hope. There's something of a safety of working in the arts, of being artists, and that more than any other a place. We feel like we find a place being a writer and being with other career creative types, and it is a place where you have a little bit more of freedom to express yourself. And so I think that the role that art plays in the society, writing, literature, visual art, film, dance, any sort of music, any sort of art, is in some ways is a society. So that's I think we picked good careers in being writers. I think, yeah.
I just want to add a little bit to that, taking up from where Ellen left off in terms of creative communities and how they speak to each other. So this project that we're doing at the moment is trying to establish connections between Indigenous Australian writers and Indigenous activist writers from India and Dalit writers. As we know that in the mainstream there's a huge blackout of information about what is really happening in terms of creativity, etc. in these communities. So this year, this is the project, Literary Commons is a project where 12 Indigenous writers are visiting India at different literary festivals and universities and trying to establish exactly the kind of dialogue that is necessary for ganging up, as Jared said. So I know that there are many writers here from Indigenous communities in Goa here, other writers are here, and other writers who want to be allies in this fight. So please take the time during this festival to come up and speak to our writers, talk to them about how these can be. Mridula, I think your question is really wonderful in terms of how it can be. How there can be stronger alliances made, especially in times of duress like the ones that we are experiencing, and how we have to keep on working and outliving different regimes, I think. So, are there any other questions?
But is there any writing being done in any Aboriginal? The question of language and who you're reaching out to, and if there's any writing or poetry or anything in your Indigenous languages, is that a concern for writers like you to preserve the languages because that's so much a part of who you are as a culture? Some thoughts on that?
Personally, I have I write. There's a bit of my language Yugambeh in my book, and it is something that it's a real motivating factor to write in my language and to express our ideas in that language. There is other Aboriginal writers that write in their languages as well. There's a poet called Uncle Lani Fogarty that writes in his language, and there's also children's books writers. That's a big field of having kind of bilingual texts. In children's books and picture books and that sort of.
Yeah, there's 600 languages in Australia, and Indigenous languages. So there's only about 20 that are still spoken as fluent everyday languages. Rolf de Heer, filmmaker with the community, has made a film entirely in language. So we've had our first Aboriginal film entirely in language with 10 Canoes, which had won various awards at the Cairns Film Festival. I write a little in language. I think most Aboriginal writers do use some degree of language, but it's good that we're starting to get our first wave of complete works in Indigenous languages.
I've just been informed we have 5 minutes left, so we'll take a question from the gentleman there.
How unrealistic is it that you were thinking, how unrealistic is it that you would inspire people, like-minded people, to stage a peaceful revolution or overthrow of the white government and majority government in Australia?
Look, I don't think it's about, we don't want to get rid of the non-Indigenous people in our country. Lots of them we like, and lots of them like us. And I think it's not about, we're such a small minority that I don't think it's possible. I think we need to push for greater representation across all sectors of our community. So that there are constantly big movements, and I mean Nicole's father has led many of these movements for the last 40 plus years. There was a big convergence in Alice Springs in Central Australia last week, where there was a formation of Aboriginal government. So rather than a government elected Aboriginal representatives, Aboriginal Australia convened to select their own leaders. Because the problem is they will coerce people that have a particular ideology that serves the government rather than serving our communities. So we're looking at better ways of self-representation.
Dream on then.
Dream on, maybe.
I do like your question. It actually made me reflect on a conversation that I had with a colleague who was, when I was a young lawyer, who was much wiser than me, much more experienced, and I was expressing frustration at how colonial the native title system was, and he sat me down and he said, look, we just have to have a 500-year plan. And I tend to agree with that. And we're fighting not just for our generation, but for our elders who are no longer with us, and also for future generations unborn. And I'm actually quite happy to continue to fight for generations who are yet to be born, rather than accept compromises that are completely unacceptable.
Maybe 2 seconds left. I'm aware that there are many young people in the audience here. Would any one of them, a little brave soul, want to ask a question? Just one last question. Okay.
I just want to know that in spite of all the spaces that you have created for yourselves amongst the non-Indigenous communities, on a day-to-day basis, what kind of social exclusions do you feel? I mean, have you faced? Have you ever felt that you are an outsider in your own land? That's something that I want to. So it's a very profound question, but I still want to know.
We can talk more about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we all feel that way. Is that right? Am I talking about the three of us? Yeah, I think, and yeah, that we feel in some ways an invisibility, and also in other ways that we don't belong, that we shouldn't speak about these things, and we feel that on a daily basis, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just to put it into context, so my father wasn't considered a citizen, a citizen. He was, Aboriginal people were considered fauna and flora until 1967. Okay, so these are the types, there's institutional racism. So the ability to remove Aboriginal children from a classroom if they were deemed to be a distraction until 1984 within the New South Wales teachers' guidelines. So, and then we see the way that policies are pushed, contemporary policies, which are about exclusion. They are racist. Yeah, so there's not the ability to speak. We don't see our people represented within the media and other areas of society.
I myself am in a very privileged position, being a lawyer and an academic. But I think it's important to point out that there are other communities and some of our people who are suffering legally sanctioned racial discrimination on a daily basis. And there is now legislation in the Northern Territory, for example, which enabled the government to seize land just because it was Aboriginal land, and put up big signs outside communities declaring prohibitions on alcohol and pornography, which serve to stigmatise all Aboriginal people living in these areas as addicts and pornographers. And in order to do that, they just wound back our Racial Discrimination Act, which the Australian government passed in fulfilment of its obligations under the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And that should be a blight on all of our citizens, but the fact that there was not really any dissent from the Australian public highlights just how pervasive racism is still in Australia.
Thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience.